Did Linux get boring? Did it did it fundamentally stop being exciting and interesting to nerds like us? Did Linux get boring? This is a question I've been asking myself actually quite a bit over the last 6 months to a year. And people have been asking me that as well, because I think a lot of people have been feeling this. And you notice that a lot of the big Linux journalists and talking heads and whatnot have been talking a lot less about Linux during 2020, myself included. People have asked me, like, why don't you talk about Linux as much as you used to? Because there was a time when that's almost all I talked about. And I was excited to do so. I was excited. And this for years and years. I mean, really, I got started just screaming from the rooftops about Linux in about 2006 or so. And so we're 14 years on from that. And really in 2020 that changed. My interest level in Linux, I won't say it declined, because I use Linux everywhere. My laptop is Linux. My devices are Linux. I love Linux. I just do. I use it everywhere. But there's a certain level of excitement that just sort of kind of petered out this year. Not just with me, but with a lot of people that I know and talk to, and a lot of the journalists that I read and converse with on a regular basis. And I'm wondering to myself why that is. And I think it's worth looking at. And I think there's a couple of reasons. I think that there is a couple of reasons, and I think the answer is did it get boring? Yes. Linux got more boring recently. Over the last few years, Linux has progressively, like last 2 or 3, gotten more and more boring. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing, because I think Linux works better now than it did. There's less fundamental drastic changes occurring, and it's not just Linux, though. There's a thing happening in operating systems in general where things have become stagnant. Because, and I think there's a lot of reasons for this, but like if you look at Windows or Mac OS, most new releases of both Windows and Mac OS aren't all that exciting. Not by comparison to previous generations. There was a period of time when a new release of a Linux distro would come out, or a big major upgrade to a desktop environment would occur, and people would be really, really excited. There was when a new version of Windows came out, Windows, even when Windows Vista came out, people were excited. And that was for Vista. And new versions of Mac OS 10, when the first Mac OS X came out, it was downright exciting. And that's reasonable because it was a fundamental architectural change. And then over the coming years, several of those Mac OS 10 versions, 10.4, 10.6, etc., were landmarks. They were big within their communities. People were really excited about them. Nowadays, the Apple and Mac users I know, and there's still lots of them, they just aren't quite as excited about the new releases of the operating systems as they were. Now, there's some hardware stuff going on. That's kind of cool. And so they get kind of excited about that, and I think justifiably. But the operating system front, it's like, well, and Windows, oh my goodness. I mean, when was the last time you legitimately talked to someone who likes Windows and it's like, I cannot wait. In 4 months, a new version of Windows 10's coming out and it's gonna be the best thing ever. When have you actually heard someone talk like that? It's been a while, right? But there was a period of time, like look at the Windows 95 launch, or the Windows 98 launch, or the Windows 2000, or Windows XP, or even, like I was saying, Windows Vista and Windows 7 and even Windows 8. These were big launches, right? People got excited about them. And nowadays, for Mac OS, not so much excitement. For new versions of Windows, not so much excitement. Not for a couple of years now. And Linux is having the same sort of thing. And I think for Linux, it's more pronounced than for Mac OS and Windows. Not because Linux is more boring than those. I think Linux is fundamentally far more interesting than either Windows or Mac OS. But because the difference is so stark. the change, the rapid pace of change, of new desktops, of massive new features, of fundamental paradigm shifts were just coming at us fast and furious for a few years. And by a few years, I mean like almost 30. For 25 plus years, stuff was changing in Linux rapidly. And it was really exciting. It was changing on the desktop and in the embedded space and in the server space. And oh my gosh, was it exciting. Nowadays, when you look at what the Linux e-news is, and when I say Linux news, I don't just mean the kernel, but I mean all of the desktop-oriented distributions, all the embedded stuff, all the server stuff that sits on top of it. So much of it nowadays is focused on stuff like Docker and Kubernetes and, this virtualization tool set here and this containerization thing over here and these sorts of things. And those are totally valid, worthwhile things. But they're just not that exciting. They're just not that fun to talk about. And I can prove that the vast majority of people agree with me on this. So I've written articles about Linux for years now, for a decade and a half or so. And I've watched the traffic, right? I've watched as the traffic goes up and down for various topics. And for these topics, for containerization and these sorts of things, for Kubernetes and Docker and whatnot, when you see those articles being written, even for the big news sites, those sometimes will only get read by a few hundred people total. All right. And we're talking the big ones. But if you write a similar article about a new version of Ubuntu or Linux Mint or heck, even Arch or something like that, you will get many factors more views. People are just generally more interested in the stuff that they can put their hands on and use. They're less interested in what the latest containerization thing is. That's just that most people are that way. I know some people, they make their living around Kubernetes, right? And they're clustering and Dockerizing and containerating, and they're super into that. And cool, right? No, I've nothing against that. Nothing against that whatsoever. But it is fundamentally less exciting, at least for me, and I think for the vast majority of people. And when you look at like new versions of GNOME, new versions of KDE, new versions of the major desktop environments, including Ubuntu, which, for better or worse, still maintains a dominant position in the mind share of both Linux users and just general computer users when they think about Linux. They think about Ubuntu. Ubuntu comes to mind first and foremost, and it has for years now. Now, there's other ones kind of coming up the ranks, but Ubuntu is still up there, right? And the fundamental changes in Ubuntu have really dropped off since Ubuntu stopped doing its own desktop environments. Right, so Ubuntu did Unity as its own desktop environment, with Mir as its display server, and Upstart as its init system. And there was a period of time when Ubuntu was really trying to, reinvent the wheel, right? They were trying to do their own thing and go their own path, and it didn't work out that great, right? It was really buggy, it was really slow, it wasn't embraced by the broader Linux and open source communities, I think, quite like the Canonical and Ubuntu folks thought it would be. And so they said, you know what, we'll back off of this, and instead we'll throw our support behind things like GNOME. So instead of Unity for the desktop, they go over to GNOME. Well, not a whole lot has happened since. And you've seen new versions of Ubuntu come out every 6 months, right? So you don't even have to wait that long. It's just like continually, there's new versions always coming out. So you're never waiting very long, which means you're never preparing yourself. You're never thinking ahead and getting excited for that big new release, at least not very much, because there's just not enough time to get excited about it. It's not like, okay, in 2 years, there's a big new version of an operating system coming out. No. At most, you're waiting 5.5 months. And then you got a whole new version, which means people aren't getting all excited about it, right? And I think that's one of the problems. And then there's not a whole lot new happening. If you look at, let's say, Ubuntu 2010, right? 20.10, which is the most recent version that came out just a month and a half, whatever ago, 2 months ago. It fundamentally does not look or behave that differently as 20.04 or 19.10 or 19.04 or 18.10. Like they look and act the same. Very minor differences, slight revisions to packages. Any major improvements are mostly under the hood and usually not in ways that directly impact me, you, or anyone else in any real significant way. Doesn't mean they're bad. Not at all. There's something good to be said for operating systems becoming a bit more boring. They become more utilitarian at that point. You can have a version of an operating system that, in theory, Ubuntu 20.10 could just be the last version of Ubuntu for 10 years. And I don't know that any of us would really notice a difference. And that's not bad, because that just means it's working well. And it is. Most recent versions of Linux, and not just Ubuntu, but variations on Arch and Mint and Manjaro and the whole kit and caboodle, PC Linux OS, all of them, they're stable and really, really good. Really, really quality. But that also is a lot less exciting. It's just not, it doesn't grab you. And I think all those reasons combined with a little general burnout on many aspects of modern technology today. The fact that most of our devices spy on us all the time. Applications tend to all be sequestered away in silos. I mean, even on Linux, it kind of gets like that a bit. It's less like that, but if you have applications that you're mostly getting every application through a package manager from an online package repository, it's not a lockdown, lock you out so you can't install other kinds of applications sort of silo, but it does have some of the same inherent problems just by design. And I think many people just are getting a little burnt out on a lot of these various things. And so what has happened with me is I've started getting really excited about older things and retro computing and retro technology and seeing where I can apply that throughout my life. I mean, I've always been somewhat into that. It's just gotten amplified as the pace of innovation has slowed drastically throughout the operating system space. And as that has happened, in conjunction with continued more spying, continued more application silos, more online-only functionality in operating systems, the rapid releasing where you aren't even preparing to think about what am I going to get 2 years from now? No, or next year you're thinking, oh, I'm getting a new version in 47 days because they just release all the friggin' time. I'm getting tired of it. I'm getting bored, and I'm thinking, I look back and I'm like, maybe I can just use older stuff more often. And so I've been ending up writing and making shows, and even in the Lunduke Journal, which if you go to lunduke.com, you can subscribe to that, get the nerdiest magazine that humanity has ever produced. But even in the Lunduke Journal, over the last 3 issues, I've written more about retro computing than I have about Linux. Linux is in there. I mean, I've talked about how to do things on Linux and all sorts of stuff because that's the main computing environment I have. And I love it. I love Linux. But it is a little less exciting. It's more boring. And it just is. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. Maybe it will. Maybe it will, but I just don't see it changing. I don't see Windows or Mac OS or Linux or any of these operating systems, including the various BSDs and all sorts of things, getting all that exciting anytime soon, unless we're talking about major paradigm shifts or rededications to some of the ideals of old computing, like being able to be offline without having any sort of functionality loss, or a rededication to using less system resources, or old school design philosophies, or a rededication to the original desktop metaphors of desktop environments, which has been kind of slipping. Unless I see some of that, I'm probably not going to get super excited about a slight revision to Docker, or a new very minor update to Firefox, which I don't even really use that much, in a slight update to Ubuntu that comes out every couple of months anyway, and no one really notices. Like, I just am not going to get that excited about it. Do I love Linux? Yeah. Linux is great. Linux is fantastic. It's awesome. And it's going to continue to be awesome. I don't foresee a time in the next couple of months where Linux is going to be, or the next couple of years, where Linux is going to be dumb or not work well, or I'm just going to want to toss it out. No, I'm going to keep using it. It's a great operating system. And I'm talking about the whole ecosystem, not just the kernel. But exciting? Exciting it is not. So anyway, that's my thoughts on the matter. I want to hear from you. If you want to talk to me, head on over to lunduke.locals.com. That's where I chat and hang out with people. There's over, I think, 1,600, 1,700 some odd people that hang out over there now. It's growing, and it's fast, and it's fun. It's imagine Twitter, but only nerds like us. No trolls whatsoever. No politics, just happy nerdy stuff like this. We just talk about nerdy stuff. We talk about how-tos, we post funny pictures. That's what we do. We just talk about nerdy stuff. So go on over there, check that out. Go to lunduke.com. There's links over there as well. It's how you can subscribe to the Lunduke Journal, which you should be doing. It's good for your soul. It's a nerdy magazine. You watch the latest videos I put out that way. I don't put every video I make up on YouTube and whatnot, but I put everything I make up over there in the Lunduke Journal site. So go to lunduke.com, subscribe over there, join in, help make all this possible, and talk to me about whether or not you think Linux is boring. Go ahead and disagree with me. Tell me Linux is not boring. Tell me it hasn't become boring. I want to hear from you. All right, everybody. I'll see you later.